This is the second of the Dr. King videos of a PowerPoint, and this one is dealing with what I have called his brilliant and timeless response to the problem. So I want to begin by saying I have a PhD in philosophy, an earned PhD in philosophy, and my topic was natural law. I wrote a dissertation entitled A Natural Law Approach to Teaching Values. And I want to say at the same time, I could not have written this document that Dr. King produced. His education was in theology. People are aware of what a charismatic man he was, what an amazing speaker he was. They love his voice. But I don't think that all that many people realize what a brilliant man he was. This man, with trying to hide from prison guards what he was doing and having to have it smuggled out of this jail, writes using a pencil on the margins where there is no print in a newspaper, and on napkins and on toilet paper, writes this document, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And he does it with no reference books, with nothing. It's just extraordinary. I have specialized knowledge in which I am trained and for which I worked in research for a long time. He did this out of his head and wrote what I could not write. I want you to appreciate what a brilliant, brilliant man Dr. King was. He was a man for the hour and for the time. And the loss of him to assassination was just a blow that was hard for anybody to fathom at the time. Okay, so that is, once again, little Ruby Bridges, and those are the real federal marshals that are portrayed in the painting that you saw from Norman Rockwell in the previous video. So in February of 1968, there began a strike that was the sanitation workers' strike, and it went from February through to April and ultimately culminated first in Dr. King's assassination. This is in Memphis, Tennessee, and also then with a resolution to the strike. And you're just going to see a few examples. There's one of the things that was a good thing that came out of this strike was that ultimately there was white college students that started marching with the African American folks who were protesting. Ultimately, about a quarter of the protesters were white folks who then started to have a conscience and to join in with what was taking place. And so these are pictures from that protest. And these men trying to say, basically, I deserve to be treated like a human being. So what precipitated this strike? February 1st, 1968, two Memphis garbage collectors, Ecole Cole and Robert Walker, were crushed to death by a malfunctioning truck. 11 days later, frustrated by the city's response to this latest event and a long pattern of neglect and abuse of its black employees who had been working with debilitated equipment and could not get anybody to care, 1,300 black men from the Memphis Department of Public Works went on strike. These were sanitation workers led by garbage collector turned union organizer T.O. Jones, and they were supported by the president of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, Jerry Worth. They demanded recognition of their union, better safety standards, and a decent wage. They had already done this kind of a thing in the past, but they couldn't get the white community, especially couldn't get the white religious community to respond and support them, which is really a sad statement. The union, which had been granted a charter by the AFSCME in 1964, had attempted to strike in 66, but failed in large part because workers were unable to arouse the support of Memphis's religious community or middle class. Conditions for black sanitation workers worsened when Henry Loeb became mayor in January 68. Loeb refused to take dilapidated trucks out of service or pay overtime when men were forced to work late-night shifts. Now, they would get that anywhere else, and I'm sure white workers, if they were required to do those sort of things, would get overtime. Sanitation workers earned wages so low that many of them were on welfare, and hundreds relied on food stamps in order to be able to feed their families. It's in Memphis where Dr. King was assassinated at the Lorraine Motel on April 4th, 1968. And so here's some of the things that they were dealing with. Because you're a black sanitation worker, you have no sick days. You might not be paid for rain days. You are required to work extra hours but do not receive overtime pay. You have no breaks, which, I mean, that's not safe, and that certainly wouldn't pass with OSHA today. You could be fired for being 1 minute late, and you work under life-threatening conditions holding maggot-infested trash bins. So how long had this kind of thing been going on? Well, if you recognize that lady's face, it's because she's Rosa Parks, the woman who refused to yield up her seat to a white woman who come to the back of the bus where she already had to sit. She couldn't sit in the front of the bus because she was African American. And she was just a tired seamstress who did not feel like getting up, so she wouldn't give up her seat. And she got arrested. This is her getting arrested for not giving up her seat to a white lady. So that's back in 1955, and it had a ripple effect that started a lot of changes. What she did was not insignificant. And then in Dr. King, this is in April 12th of 1963, when he got arrested at the Birmingham jail. You can see he's dressed nicely. These folks tried to comport themselves in a manner that was very professional and that was non-oppositional to law enforcement, but nonetheless they got mistreated and he got jailed. He and Ralph Abernathy, his fellow organizer of that march, they both were put in solitary confinement, and the rest of the other the folks that marched with them also were arrested, most of them put in cells where there was large groups of them. This gives you just a picture of the kind of thing that you would have seen if you were an African American man or woman in that time. Little kids, think of the brainwashing and the hate that has to be behind putting into the mind of a child. What you see up there with that little girl on the left, or this little boy down below. We won't go to school with Negroes. We want to keep our school white. And you can see this African American woman on the right. Here's this dilapidated sign, an indicator of the kind of care that would be given to Dade County Parks, Virginia Beach colors only section of the beach. So here's a question for you. This isn't actually dealing with natural law or Dr. King's response or any of that. This is dealing with something personal, and should you be treated cruelly and with behaviors that denigrate you as a human being? Why did Ruby Bridges, Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and Dr. King so strongly emphasize reconciliation and forgiveness rather than crying out for justice and retribution? Now, justice, Dr. King did cry for, but justice of equality, not justice of people being, having that the wrong things done to African American people would be avenged upon them. But why did they emphasize reconciliation, forgiveness, nonviolence? Why did they do that? What do those four people teach us about basic mental health and well-being? Because I think they do have something important to teach to you and me. What are the long-term effects of responding to racial hatred or other forms of abuse with reciprocal racial hatred and abuse, if you hate them back? What does that do to you? If we hate back, then we allow the abusers, we allow the racists to determine the course or the trajectory of our own lives and our own character. They do something to us. They turn us into haters. Righteous indignation is one thing. It's right to be angry about these things. But bitterness, resentment, and hatred, they drag us down. They make you like the one who abuses you. I want to say you don't have to become a chump in order to forgive. You don't have to become a doormat. You can set boundaries. You can refuse to let an evil person hurt you any further. But you can do those things without holding on to hate. And here's the thing. To harbor unforgiveness and hatred within is actually to do harm actively to yourself. That other person, the person who has maligned and mistreated you, they're not troubled by your hatred. It's like shooting BBs at a rhinoceros. It accomplishes nothing. It just eats you up inside. So letting go of hatred and forgiving is like taking off leg irons and leaving behind the weight that they had put upon you. So just a little food for thought. So still speaking about the legacy of Dr. King, but now coming to his brilliant and timeless response to the problem as regards the law. So the first video here spoke about his assessment of what was wrong, and now this one addresses his answer. He says, to a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. Now, the civil disobedience that Socrates practiced got him killed. And the apology is what you want to read if you want to, the apology of Socrates by Plato is what you want to read if you want to know the details of that. It's actually quite a short document, and it's well worth the read. But this tells you that Dr. King had read Plato and was familiar with this whole story, and it had stood out to him as being significant. He says, one may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? And his answer is that there's two types of law. There are just laws, and then there are unjust laws. He says, I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal, but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. And he goes on to say, I would agree with St. Augustine, that an unjust law is no law at all. If you're unaware of why Augustine would be saying this, Augustine is not saying this from his religious thought process, but because he's strongly influenced by Plato via the later philosopher that came after Plato by the name of Plotinus. Plotinus had a strong influence on Augustine, Platonic thought on Augustine. And of course, Plato is Aristotle's teacher. I'd said that this is Aristotelian. He says, let me give another explanation. An unjust law is a code inflicted upon a minority which that minority had no part in enacting or creating because they did not have the unhampered right to vote. Okay, so we're talking about parts of the South where it's majority African American, but the African American population is not getting a chance to vote, not being able to vote. Who can say that the legislature of Alabama, which set up the segregation laws, was democratically elected? They had intimidated people about trying to vote. Throughout the state of Alabama, all types of conniving methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters, and there are some counties without a single Negro registered to vote, despite the fact that the Negro constitutes a majority of the population. Can any law set up in such a state be considered democratically structured? This is just a picture from back in the 1940s of one of the safe places where one might register to vote. However, what you need to be aware of is there are people out here taking pictures, and other places where people would try to go to register to vote, there would be police with dogs or people standing around with baseball bats. To be an African American and be able to vote in the South during the days of the Jim Crow laws was something that was dangerous. I mean, you might have repercussions of just trying to exercise your right as a citizen. This is a picture of Dr. King after he was in hospital when he had at a book signing event, and he had a woman attack him, and she came close to killing him. It was with a pen, by the way. Little girl wrote this, and she said, Dear Dr. King, I'm a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School. While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I am a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I'm simply writing to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze. So there was people, old and young, and obviously I'm speaking about white people who did express their support of Dr. King, but there was sadly much less support than what you would expect. These are those men on that bridge in Birmingham where the confrontation ultimately takes place, and you can see they purposely have their hands in their pockets. They're standing in as non-threatening a posture as they possibly can. They're about to be set upon by dogs and fire hoses and police who are very brutal towards them. But they have prepared for this. This is now a picture from the sanitation workers' strike, and this is actually the day before Dr. King's death. So he goes on to say, I submit that an individual who breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for law. I agree with that. I mean, if you decide, there's this old song from a TV show back in the 1970s, if you can't do the time, then don't do the crime. But this isn't a crime. This is that they are going against a law that they believe is an unjust law, and they're willing to take the consequences. That's what Gandhi was willing to do in India as well. They were willing to pay the price. How does one determine when a law is just or unjust, asked Dr. King. A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. In the next video, you'll see where this idea comes from. It's not a Christian idea originally, although it is found in Christianity and Judaism, and in actually most Eastern philosophies and religions as well, not just in the West, but also in the East. But as far as our first instantiation of it, it's found in the 5th century, in the 440s BC or BCE, in the writing of Sophocles. We'll see that in the next video. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, now we've jumped forward to the 1200s, our time, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. It should be said that Thomas Aquinas was very much devoted to the writings of Aristotle. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. He goes on to say, we can never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany, but I'm sure that if I'd lived in Germany during that time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers, even though it was illegal. If I lived in a communist country today where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I believe I would openly advocate disobeying these anti-religious laws. Now, this is a little further on, and this is something I've heard him say in person. Again, I said to you in the previous video, I have a recording of all of his speeches. And so there's this rich, beautiful voice saying all segregation statutes are unjust because segregations distort the soul and damage personality. So Dr. King goes on to use Martin Buber and his concept of I-thou. Martin Buber's concept of I-thou, that tells you he's kind of widely read. He's a Jewish existentialist philosopher of the first part of the 20th century. And it uses what's called a square of opposition, which is, again, an Aristotelian concept. So here's the picture of the square of opposition. And let's move through these different points. It-thou, if somebody's in an it-thou relationship, now that means I think I'm not significant, but you are significant. So thou is rich language towards an individual, respectful language towards that individual, but insignificant language towards me. That I think I'm not significant, you are significant. In an it-it relationship, I don't think I have any value or worth, and I don't think you have any value or worth either. It's a very low view of humanity. If we're speaking about an I-thou relationship, we're speaking about me having a concept that I have significance and value and worth, and so do you. And then the last one of these is the I-it. This is the position of most of the white folks who are for the Jim Crow laws and who are not supportive of the civil rights activity. They think they are significant, but they think that the African American folks with whom they are dealing are nothing. That's I-it. So he's encountering I-it kind of thought, and he's saying that the kind of thought that we need to have is I-thou, that we would have, that there was a mutual appreciation for, respect, and regard for others. To use the words of Martin Buber, he says, the great Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for an I-thou relationship and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. So segregation is not only politically, economically, and sociologically unsound, but it is, and is the way he says it in a number of speeches, morally wrong and sinful. One example of the approach to law of which Dr. King wrote would be when the International Military Tribunal at the Nuremberg trials found the lawyers for the Nazis claiming that their clients were being tried by ex post facto laws, means after the fact. These laws did not obtain, these laws were not in force in the Weimar Republic or in the Third Reich when we did the things that we did, so we don't recognize the validity of your laws. This is the charter of the tribunal for the international, and this group of nations that was now trying them in what would eventually become the equivalent of the World Court. Robert Jackson, chief counsel for the United States, he headed the prosecution, declared, in interpreting the charter, however, he's responding to the claims of their lawyers that they're ex post facto. In interpreting the charter, however, we should not overlook the unique and emergent character of this body as an international military tribunal. It is not bound by the procedural and substantive refinements of our respective judicial or constitutional systems. In other words, it's not provincial. This isn't English. This isn't American. This isn't Russian. This is human. Nor will its rulings introduce precedents into any country's internal system of civil justice. He goes on to say that as an international military tribunal, it rises above the provincial and transient and seeks guidance not only from international law, but also from the basic principles of jurisprudence, which are assumptions of, they're givens of civilization, and which have found embodiment in the codes of all nations. So what I'm saying is Dr. King's kind of reasoning that he used is the same kind of reasoning that we used as a nation when we participated in the trials of the war criminals of Nazi Germany at the Nuremberg trials. So he has strong precedent for saying what he says. And we're going to see more of that in the next video. Jackson responded to the claims that the war criminals were being tried after the fact by laws that didn't obtain in their country in their time by saying that the tribunal was dealing with laws that were transnational and transcultural. This is the same kind of thing to which Dr. King is referring. And I would refer you just to our Declaration of Independence. You remember how it begins? It says, "We hold these truths to be" what? Self-evident. Dr. King is referring to self-evident knowledge in terms of how it's usually written or spoken of with regard to Aristotelian thought, the thought of Aristotle. This is per se nota knowledge, that which is obvious, which cannot be argued. You can't help but know it. And we'll end there.